Hi everyone, in this demo I'm going to show you a painting technique called Imprimatura. It's going to be a little bit different than what we've done so far. So rather than building up our lights with thicker white paint or paint that has white added to it, we're actually going to be subtracting our whites. So we're going to begin by adding a layer of pigment, color value down, onto the painting surface, and we'll be rubbing out paint and getting the white of the canvas back, both with paper towels, with some Q-tips, and also with your brush. So I'm going to show you that with two different paintings. I'm going to paint a painting of a skull onto here, and there's also this painting that I created of one of my climbing shoes that will show you this technique as well. So this is going to include a time lapse of this painting, and I'm going to show you in real time some of these techniques with the skull painting that I'm about to start now.
Here is a quick rundown of an imprimatura. First, wet your canvas with a thin layer of paint medium and apply your tone, in this case burnt umber. Use a paper towel or rag to evenly rub the tone into the surface. Draw in your subject and establish the shadow mass. Begin wiping out the lights. This can only work while the paint is still wet. The harder you rub, the more paint you will remove, and the brighter your light will appear. This is the process you'll be using for your shoe paintings. Now I'll unpack these techniques in real time over the course of the rest of the video with a few more time lapses as well. I want you to really be able to see what I'm doing and get a grasp of this process.
Alright everyone, I'm going to be showing an Imprimatura painting method. I'll be painting a skull in the same way that I painted this climbing shoe. So Imprimatura is when you are adding a tone down to the canvas. In the case of this climbing shoe, I was adding down burnt umber. That is what you will be doing this week. I'm going to be adding down a slightly, a different tone for the skull painting, but it's going to be the same exact type of process. So a few essential things. You're going to need quite a few paper towels. I'll be using this to smooth some of the paint out onto the surface once I start putting this tone down, and you're going to be using it to wipe away paint to bring back some of the white of the canvas and to get the lighter tones of your painting. So rather than building up the whites by adding down that white or lighter paint, you're going to be subtracting the paint both with your paper towels. If you have Q-tips, these can be incredibly useful. You can kind of sculpt in thinner, or wipe away, sculpt out thinner areas with the Q-tip. And then also the brush, our brushes will both be used to add tone down, so in the darker areas, but then you can wipe it off and even add a little bit of medium to it, and it's going to be a really great tool for also wiping away paint and bringing back out those lights. So these are all going to be essential. Your paper towels, Q-tips if you have them. If you do have them, I definitely recommend trying it out. And then of course your brushes. Now to begin, I'm going to actually add just do a thin layer of medium down onto my canvas, so I can even just squeeze some of that out, and I'm going to begin spreading that around with my largest brush here. Okay, so that's going to be your first step, is adding a layer of medium down. It's a bit of paint to my brush, that's okay. So you just want to be able to have a kind of slick surface that you're going to be adding the paint down onto. Now you don't want this to be a super thick layer of medium by any means, okay? You want to be adding this in a thin layer, so I'm going to be spreading this medium all around my canvas. But I want a surface where when I start to put the paint down, it's I'm going to be able to spread it all around and have it be somewhat fluid. Now we again are working in a solvent-free capacity in this class, because I don't want you bringing a bunch of solvent at home in a non-ventilated space. What would be a bit more traditional with this technique when you're wetting the canvas would be to use a combination of linseed oil and mineral spirits. But again, I don't want you using mineral spirits at home when you're just in your room or not in a ventilated area. If, however, you are in a ventilated area and you happen to have Gamsol or mineral spirits at home, you could try wetting the canvas with a combination of, again, linseed oil and that solvent, whether that's Gamsol or mineral spirits. And I will put the ratio for that combination of linseed oil and mineral spirits into the lesson page for those that might be interested. But this also works using our solvent-free gel. Okay, so I just kind of want to coat that entire surface. You don't want to see any big lumps like that or ridges. You want to kind of meld this layer of medium into the surface. It should be really thin. We just kind of want a slick surface to be putting our paint down onto. All right, I have finished adding my thin layer of my solvent-free gel down to the surface. So now my surface is a bit slick. And now I'm going to begin toning my canvas. Now, as I said before, in this shoe painting, which you'll be trying something like this is using burnt umber, which is a very traditional Imprimatura approach. It's how many artists from Da Vinci to Norman Rockwell would establish their underpaintings in a painting like this. I'm going to do this skull painting in something slightly different. I've mixed a neutral from quinacridone magenta and phthalo green, which is going to give me a nice kind of purple that I'm pretty obsessed with. So I'm going to be using this for my skull painting. So I just mixed that, just was putting what was on my palette knife out onto the canvas, and now I need to smooth this into my canvas surface. You can see, since I have put down that layer of my solvent-free gel, the paint is really moving on the surface, which is exactly what I want. So now I'm going to coat this entire surface with this tone of quinacridone magenta and phthalo green. Okay, I have put down a whole tone of my quinacridone magenta and phthalo green combination, which has made a, which is a sort of neutral, but this is also, you can see, kind of a beautiful purple. Now I want this to be more of, I want to aim for more of kind of a mid-tone with this. So what you do when you're doing Imprimatura, you do this layer of paint down, and then you're going to take one of your paper towels, or if you have a t-shirt rag, that's great too. And we're going to start to wipe away some of this paint and kind of get it into the surface too. So I'm going to start to go ahead and do that. And I want to aim for kind of an even surface. And it's going to be a little bit textured, which I actually think can be really beautiful. You can get these really nice textures. I just don't want these super deep darks here, because I want to be able to go back in and paint those in where I actually want them to be in my composition ultimately. Okay. And whatever rag you use, you could actually take this and tone another canvas with it if you wanted to. If it gets loaded with paint like this, you can wipe that onto another canvas. That can create a really nice tone to then make another painting on top of later. Okay, so this rag is getting quite saturated. I'm going to set this to the side and grab another one. You can see you're going to go through quite a few paper towels. I'll need to get more paper towels before I really begin my painting, because I'll need some paper towels just to wipe out my lights. But you can already see if I took this and I went like that, you can wipe out a light. That's what we'll be doing in this painting. But I don't want that white there yet, so I'm going to add that tone back in. And in the shoe painting time lapse, which we'll be showing after this, you'll see me do this same process with burnt umber. This is also super interesting because as I'm wiping out a bit of this quinacridone magenta and phthalo green combination, you can start to really see the color of that combination of that neutral that I've created. When I put it down just that combination, it looks almost like a black. But as we start to wipe it away, and as some of that white of the canvas is coming through, we can see it's quite a gorgeous purple. Okay, this is getting to a nice point of tone. And you know, in the way that you're wiping it out, you could be even creating some type of interesting pattern that you like. So you can think of the direction of your strokes as you're wiping. Do you like the patterns that that your towel or rag is creating? And you could be leaving some of that in the final painting. So I'm thinking of that, because I think I'm going to want that in this piece, some of that maintained. Okay, so that is a good point of tone. Now I'm going to start to sketch out my skull, obviously using one of my brushes. So I'm gonna be sketching that out with my kind of medium-sized filbert, and again that's going to be with this combination of quinacridone magenta and phthalo green. Once I have sketched that in, then I am going to start to wipe out my lights. Now, one thing before I proceed with all of that, you should know that as you're starting these paintings, and there'll be many reminders of this throughout this whole process, but as you're working on this painting, when you're subtracting out the lights, the paint has to be wet when you're doing that. So if you let this painting dry, you're no longer going to be able to go in and take out those lights with a paper towel or a Q-tip or your brush. So when you start this painting, you have to be prepared to, at the very least, go into all of your light areas while the painting is wet.
Once you have your tone layer established, you can map in your subject. Approach your subject by considering the simple shapes it is made of. Remember to begin from a general to specific approach, placing the major shapes first and gradually working up to details once the foundation is solid. Make sure to consider the edges of your canvas too and where you are placing your subject.
Okay, so I have done a basic statement of the shadow mass here, I'm going to start to take out some of my lights. Now I'm going to begin doing that because, again, we're working on a wet surface here. I can only take out my lights as long as this paint is still wet. So I want to, I need to get all of my lights out in this session. So I've established my shadow mass as kind of a roadmap of where my values are at. And I'm going to start to take out some of these lights. I'm going to be using a combination of my paper towel, Q-tip, and then also my brushes as well can work as ways of both adding paint and subtracting paint. So I'm going to start, and again, I'm going to refine these shadows more later. I'm just doing a basic value statement for now, and I'm also going to return to the background too. So I'm going to start by going and kind of keying in my brightest area, so I have that as kind of a reference, and then I can start to build my sort of intermediate values with my darkest darks, right, and my lightest lights kind of in mind. And then also in the background there'll be some very darks too. I'll start to establish some of those a little bit later on, but I do have some very darks within the form, and I have those as a reference for myself. So I want to start to also, I can see this kind of cheekbone on this side is closest. It's the skull I'm working from is underlit, so the light source is coming from below, and it's also to the right, and it's making this cheekbone on the right hand side really light up. So I'm carving some of that out with this Q-tip. Okay, you can see how bright we can get that to go. Okay, so through here at the top of the eye socket. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple of different ways of taking this paint out. So one, obviously, I was just demonstrating with a Q-tip. Once it starts to get really saturated, it's not going to work as well, or it can just be a way of more kind of lightly, gradually taking out value, which would be really nice too. You're not going to want to carve out the lights really intensely everywhere. It's only where you're seeing that brightest light. You can kind of work in a way where you start by establishing some of your brightest lights, and then you start working back down the value scale. Okay, so another way of taking out, subtracting this paint and getting our light. So you're going to want to take a brush, you could clean it off. So I don't really have any paint in my brush now, and I can go in and start to take out some of this paint. And as you do this, you also need to keep getting that paint out of your brush. Okay? So you can subtract a bunch of paint, right? And then you could go in with another brush. So you could scrub out some paint, and that could kind of have a harder edge. You could go in with another brush, a softer, this is a medium-sized filbert, and these are all kind of soft bristles. And you can go in and kind of maybe soften that up a little bit. So that's something you'll be doing throughout this entire process, scrubbing out light, going back in and softening it up. Okay, now for larger planes that you want to remove, you might have some really, whole big plane of light that you want to get out. So I'm going to take one of your paper towels and kind of holding it like this. So I have my finger in there, and now I can go in and I'm taking out this light mass that I see on the top of the skull. So it starts to get saturated. You can kind of rotate the paper towel around. Okay, so this is going to be really nice for those areas, those kind of larger. You can also take it, kind of pinch it like this. Use it that way as well. Okay, you can kind of roll the paper towel. Whatever way you kind of feel comfortable using it. The paper towel is obviously a lot bigger. It's more kind of a blunt instrument for taking out this light, so it's great for kind of larger planes. But for example, in the kind of nose, the area in the nose in here where there's these thin parts of bone that are very thin edge, I'll want to take that out more with like this small flat brush. Be nice for that. So, and I'm gonna get a little bit of medium on my brush that can help remove the paint too. So I'm not adding any paint to it, just a little bit of medium. You can see how that helps you carve out the light. Okay. So your small flat brush is going to be more of a precision tool. The paper towel is going to be great for larger planes. And the Q-tip is also going to be nice for smaller areas too, and you can get this kind of scrubby texture. This, you can get these almost kind of fine lines that you're drawing out from the paint. And you just want to make sure that you're getting the paint off of the brush as you go when you're trying to subtract. And again, so now this is not really taking anything away, but I can go back in, get some medium on my brush. So I added a little bit more medium down there. Now I should be able to lift some of that paint out. Okay, so brush, paper towel, and Q-tip. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to transition to a time lapse as I start to map more of this painting in, and we'll come back for another in real time moment when I'm going back into some of my shadow areas.
As you wipe out your lights, get a sense of where your brightest light is and establish that right away as a reference for yourself. Map out the large planes of light using the paper towel and get finer details with the Q-tips and your brushes. Don't wipe out all of the lights super brightly everywhere. Pay attention to the actual values that you see in your painting subject. The harder you wipe out, the brighter the light will appear. And the softer you wipe, the softer the transition will be.
Okay, I'm at a point where I've kind of established some of my brightest lights and getting into some more subtle light areas where maybe I don't want to remove as much. And there's also parts of, in this shadow over in here, I want to bring in the reflected light a little bit. So I want to lighten parts of the shadow just a touch. And then I'll be putting in some of this darker part of the shadow in. So when you're wanting to remove just a little bit, you can even take one of your Q-tips that has been kind of saturated from before and use that to kind of lightly graze some paint off of the surface. And I'm using kind of a softer touch here versus in those really bright, those areas that I want to make much brighter, I have a much drier Q-tip and I'm pressing down and scrubbing into the surface. So the harder you scrub into the surface, the more likely you are to bring out that white, that pure white of the canvas, which obviously you only want to do in sections that are really bright like that are the, kind of highlight areas, the areas really being hit by light that you want to stand out. In other sections, like as we get into these transition sections where we're transitioning from light family into shadow family, you could have one of your Q-tips that you've already used and use that to drag out a little bit of paint. And then you can also, again, go back in and soften areas of transition with a brush and a light touch. Okay, so transitions, removing just a bit of paint is going to be a light touch, whether that's with the Q-tip, the paper towel, or a brush. Now I'm going to try taking out some of my reflected light with my brush right now. Just doing a good job. Okay, so I'm going to bring out the reflected light a little bit, which remember is on the shadow side. It's where that light is bouncing into the shadow a bit and it lightens up a bit. That reflected light is still part of the shadow family, so I don't want to go in and make this bright as though it's a light. It is not a light. It is just lighter relative to the darker parts of the shadow. So you have to be subtle with your reflected light. Anyway, so I'm kind of dragging that out a bit, and then okay, but we have our core shadows kind of in here. Ooh, that's maybe a little too much. Okay, so removing some of that reflected light. There's also reflected light on this part of the jawbone, and it's a little bit brighter on the jawbone because it's closer to the light source is coming from over here. So this section is closer to the light source than that section. Okay, so now I can also start to go in and I want to darken parts of the background. Now I wanted to remove that reflected light before I darkened my background so that I didn't completely lose this side of the skull. Now I will kind of soften this edge a little bit so it feels like the skull is really merging into the background, but I didn't want to lose that edge entirely. I want to kind of start off by having the option of the edge, and then I can go in and soften it in areas. Okay, so I'm going to start to pop in parts of this very dark background. Okay. So I'm going to get a little bit more in here, and then I will show you just softening that edge a little bit so it feels like the shadow is kind of merging with the background. So we can have the light perhaps having a slightly harder edge in some places so it really pops forward, and we can soften the shadow's edge so it feels like it's merging into the background. So how we approach edges, whether it's soft or hard, is going to help us build a sense of form and of space. Okay. Da, 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 da. All right. So I'm going to start to get into this edge now, and I'll do more work on the background, but I want to get into this edge a little bit. So what I'm going to do is kind of remove the paint from my brush, and when I'm softening an edge, I'm kind of raking my brush over the surface. Okay, you can change directions. And we can even kind of bring that shadow down in there. softly dabbing the surface and blending out that edge a little bit. I'm breaking up that line a little bit and changing the direction of these strokes. So it has a little bit of a atmospheric kind of feel. Okay. Alright, and then maybe I want to even emphasize a little bit more over in here in this light section, getting a kind of hard edge to contrast with this softened edge over here. So I might even go in and I'm adding a little bit of medium down, which is going to allow me to really carve out some paint. So this is kind of the lightest section. It's also kind of coming forward. Okay, and now I could go in with a dry Q-tip, one that also isn't too fuzzy or floppy. Okay, and I can go in and both remove that paint and create a harder edge. I'm also going to kind of manipulate this edge with my brush too. Okay, so I'm going to go back in with this flat brush. And kind of refine that edge. That got a little too hard in here, so I'm going to get rid of that, but I can keep that little hard edge that I like. Okay, so that's a variety of applications in this wipeout method. I'll continue on this painting so you can see me finish that up. And as always, if you ever have any questions with how to do any of this, feel free to follow up with a message to me.
In the final stages of the Imprimatura, I'm returning to some areas of light to brighten and refine, and I also want to make sure to put in a dark background surrounding the skull. The background will make the light section pop forward, and the shadow section will meld with the background. I return to some edges to harden, in the light mask for example, and other edges to soften. Remember, you can only take out the lights while the paint is wet. Feel free to experiment with some of the interesting textures you can create with the paper towels and Q-tips. The wipeout textures are part of the fun of Imprimatura.